I'd like to talk to you today about an incident that's been in the news recently because it touches on a larger issue. As you may already be aware, a teenager by the name of J.Carter was arrested a number of months ago for terroristic threats. He was released earlier this month because an anonymous donor paid his $500,000 bond, but still needs to stand trial. He was arrested because someone called him crazy in a League of Legends match, and he made a joke about shooting up a school and cannibalism, and he even included an LOL just kidding. This clearly sarcastic remark was then used as a pretense to indefinitely detain him as a potential terrorist without trial for several months, during which he was put in solitary confinement, beaten by other prisoners, and then had to be detained without clothing or access to other devices out of concern he might try to kill himself. No evidence was found to support his arrest. There were no weapons, no plans, no indicator of an actual attempt to conduct a school shooting of any kind. However, he was detained for months after that anyway, and likely would have continued to be detained if someone hadn't paid the $500,000. But Balthazar, he's out of jail. Why even talk about this? Well, this is part of a much bigger issue. In this video's description, you'll find a couple links to a Supreme Court case called Bradenburg v. Ohio. Basically, it means that advocating violence isn't sufficient to arrest someone. So first off, the entire incident was illegal. However, its illegality didn't prevent the aforementioned teenager from being indefinitely detained and tortured by the American government. As a meritocrat, I constantly receive opposition to my political ideology on the grounds that laws should always be followed by the citizenry, and that if the laws aren't followed, then the government won't follow laws either. But here's the thing, the government already doesn't follow laws. They already break them whenever they find it convenient. And this is an issue I've talked about in a previous video. Our legal system in this country basically exists to deceive people into believing that the legal system adequately protects them. Its purpose is not to provide protection. Its purpose is to maintain the illusion of protection. But that's far too inconvenient a reality to recognize, so people are willing to throw random innocent people under the bus to help preserve and maintain the delusion, very similar to the concept of performing human sacrifices to a sun god. This is very clearly demonstrated by the people who say the teen deserved it for making a joke about shooting up a school. People will fabricate reasons why his arrest was justified, no matter how fallacious or short-sighted, because not doing so is a threat to the illusion that the legal system protects them. Let me ask you something. Is there anyone who plays first-person shooter games who hasn't made a joke about school shootings? The joke he told should have been accepted as sarcasm and dismissed without any notice very easily considering the circumstances. And with Carter, people can see that his words were insensitive or that he made a mistake. No, he didn't do anything wrong at all. He told a dark joke in a competitive video game, which are awash with dark jokes and are socially normal. It would not be uncommon for someone to respond to his comment by going, nom 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 heart food, and the group laughing about it. But that is, again, too inconvenient a fact to recognize. It's much easier for people to focus on the flaws of others instead of their own flaws. This is an old thread from when I used to post on the League of Legends forum. Basically, the thread's maker thought that Riot, the company that owns League of Legends, was releasing champions at an unfairly high price to essentially exploit the microtransaction system, and he said he'd sponsor an African child if the next champion was released at a lower price. He immediately received quite a bit of criticism for not already sponsoring the African child, and a bunch of people insulting him and calling him a bad guy. I, having still been on hospital drugs at the time and having spent much of my recovery on the internet, came to his defense by pointing out that most of the people criticizing him for not sponsoring the African child right off the bat probably give less of their own disposable income to starving kids in Africa, and thus are being hypocritical. For Mr. Carter, this is going to be reflected for the rest of his life. He is going to be in job interviews, and they're going to sneer at him going, "Oh, you told a dark joke in a video game once, huh? What kind of sociopath are you?" And the irony is that the people denying him a job under the pretense that he's a sociopath would probably be sociopaths themselves by their own standards. But these standards aren't meant to be applied to oneself. No, these standards are only for use on other people. An entirely different set of standards is what they use to judge themselves. What is my point here? The point is that most of the people who actually say this teenager deserved to be locked up for terroristic threats have likely made terroristic threats at some point in their life as well, because most people will at some point or another tell a dark or offensive joke, and by their own logic they should turn themselves in and be indefinitely detained and tortured. But I don't see anyone lining up at the police office asking to be arrested for some reason. Because recognizing facts is too inconvenient. That threatens the illusion. It's much more comfortable to pounce on the unlucky person of focus and criticize them so people can feel better about themselves and feel like they're morally superior, and just forget that the same criticisms apply to themselves. It's childish and it's pathetic, and anyone who thought this kid deserved to be locked up, or conceded that he did something wrong at all, should be ashamed of themselves. However, this issue is still a lot bigger than one teenager. Now, why was his bail set so high at $500,000? Well, it was probably to persuade him into pleading guilty to get a reduced sentence and be threatened with indefinite detention and torture if he didn't. It was a cheap trick to convict an innocent person. Now, why would the government come down so hard on someone who didn't do anything wrong and continue to detain him illegally after no evidence was found against him and he should have been released? It's to set an example. It's to make people uncomfortable with what they say on the internet. It's to make people reconsider their words and censor themselves. Because if people keep getting locked up for things as small as telling jokes, they might gradually become less comfortable with expressing their opinions on the internet. But if telling a joke gets you locked up and tortured, who knows what'll happen if you dare to present a conflicting political ideology or adopt an unorthodox stance on topics like school shootings. And this is one of the reasons I made a YouTube channel that was both video game related and politics related, because I made the prediction that gamers, due to the internet affiliation, would be progressively pulled into politics because we're convenient scapegoats. Now, why is the Bradenburg v. Ohio case important? Basically, it's important to have the intellectual freedom to consider other ideologies, regardless of how taboo a subject they may be to a society, or how heavily you might disagree with them. People need to be able to discuss an ideology, even if the ideology in itself is violent. If, for example, I thought that the 9/11 terrorist attacks were the greatest thing to ever happen, and someone asked why, we should be able to have a discussion about why I adopt that stance, for my points to be either agreed with or debunked. Because the only way to debunk it or agree with it in a civilized manner is to discuss it, even if the ideology in itself sanctions terrorism or shooting up schools. It's important to be able to discuss it. Now, if sarcasm or non-threatening jokes can be considered terroristic threats, how much more so talking about an ideology that isn't in the blanket label of Democrat or Republican you're supposed to be aligned with in the United States? I suppose I may be perceiving the incident with Mr. Carter to be a bigger concern than a lot of other people seem to see it, though that has a bit to do with my political ideology. This incident with Mr. Carter seems to be a warning. Watch what you say, keep quiet or else. I perceive that as a way to silence people who adopt unorthodox opinions that the majority may consider deviant enough to be worth restricting. Suppose, for example, we discuss a topic that may be taboo. Suppose I want to push for legal reform in the United States and cite the inefficiency of the law as a reason to do so. Suppose I put forward the idea that the legal system in the United States wasn't capable of providing for the needs of its citizens and that, consequently, I saw no moral issue with people behaving outside the law when the law failed to do its job, since the government already ignores the law, and that people could get away with crimes fairly easily, and I cite how as evidence. These, of course, being prime evidence for why the legal system needs reform. If Bradenburg v. Ohio is ignored, citing evidence for why a legal system needs reform is in itself an unlawful activity. The very act of pointing out that people are living under an illusion is in itself an act of terrorism. This is bigger than people's rights to tell dark jokes. If people aren't allowed to hear a dark joke about shooting some children, they certainly won't be allowed to hear a serious discussion about ideologies that actually do kill children. I am not a Republican or a Democrat. I am a meritocrat, and this state of affairs goes against the very basis of my ideology. Meritocracy is basically use what's proven to work best. Rational discourse, science, and critical examination are all key tenets. It's essential for a citizenry to be able to intellectually analyze different viewpoints, even ones that would be considered taboo or unorthodox. Suppose I have to decide between two regions that need relief aid, but only have the resources to save one. Either choice made will result in the deaths of several thousand people, including their various children. Suppose someone advocates a stance that is morally different from what is commonly accepted, and suggests that the money we have for the relief aid project could be better spent on research of a dangerous disease, as a more long-term life-saving investment. Suppose we debate serious topics such as if we should or should not torture prisoners. It is essential that these topics be discussed, because if you can't demonstrate how the legal system is broken, then its flaws will never be addressed. Ideologies that are different need to be examined in order to understand them, even if you don't agree with them, and it is essential to have examined both sides, because if your ideology is adopted simply because it's the one you were born into, then there's no guarantee it's actually correct. This is the cornerstone of meritocratic ideology, or at least mine. As Aristotle phrased it, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. It is very important for a voting population to understand the issues they're voting over. Attempting to make people watch what they say is something I have a problem with, because I feel it's a threat to a much more important right. Someone can feel dark jokes to be distasteful, but making them illegal is ridiculous, and more importantly, I'm concerned that people who would want to make them illegal, some of whom are your government, if you are a U.S. citizen, aren't people who would be known for their ability to examine other points of view intelligently, and that makes me think they wouldn't have a qualified opinion, and shouldn't be trusted with the responsibility of deciding who lives and who dies when you decide how to reform your legal system. I'm concerned that if a dark joke about a school shooting is too much for people to handle, to the extent that people need to incarcerate those who make jokes, then there's no way a citizenry or state like that could listen to an ideology that actually sanctions killing kids long enough to understand it. There's no way they could handle actually having the responsibility of deciding who lives and who dies and how to manage these situations responsibly. That would mean that, according to Aristotle, the US government and a portion of our citizenry do not want the rest to have educated minds. They're happier being told what to think. I'm not happy being told what to think because I think it'll lead to the eventual downfall of this country, and the government wanting the citizenry to be uneducated is something that I find deeply disturbing. That's just something that I feel wasn't given proper attention, and I figured I'd give my 2 cents on it. I'll see you next time.